Poverty was the driving force.
Yes.
Poverty was the driving force because, again, we were very, very poor. We were not recognized by any government. We couldn't go to school because at that time we weren't paying taxes because of the road allowance.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't benefit from housing because they wouldn't put a house on a road allowance. So therefore our people had a struggle of being on the outside of the system. And at that time, if you got any schooling at all, you had to go here and there to find a school. And
Certainly,
that's what I had to do, to get some education.
You're not First Nations, so you couldn't take any of the benefits there from schooling, and so you're really caught in between there.
Yeah.
Did you experience any of that poverty in your community, Jim, when you think back of growing up in your community?
Yes, although it wasn't, it wasn't quite, drastic, I guess, as it is in the South, as people describe it sometimes. Because in the North, you always still had the bush. You always had the lakes and the rivers, and there was, if you needed, you could still sneak out. I know it was illegal for Métis people to go shoot a moose out of season, for example. But a lot of that still happened because that's part of our survival, and that's that's how we became such good at living off the land because we had to do it in secrecy a lot, and yes, the poverty was not quite as prevalent even in the 30s. I remember talking to some of the elders in the North, and they were finding it a little bit strange that people from the South were coming into the North, like non-Aboriginal people, because they were hungry in the South, and in the 30s, I guess it was very, very difficult, so it wasn't quite that bad. What happened in the North, though, was the fact that the rights of people, the rights of Métis people, was always dominated by outside forces, like the missionaries, the RCMP, the social welfare people, Hudson Bay, and all of those types, and that's what happened. That's what kept people down a lot, in the North.
That's interesting that you say the missionaries, because were the missionaries political in the sense that they asked you to vote a certain way? Are you saying?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, they made sure that people voted in the right way and were doing
the right
things.
way? Was it the right way? Which party were they talking about here? which party was involved?
Well, they didn't. I think I think the right-wing parties were
liberals.
Yes, absolutely.
And the missionaries were. Why would they do that? Were they getting patronage from the Liberal?
Well, a lot of them were French-speaking missionaries,
okay.
and they came in from Quebec, and they never did like the Conservatives, I guess, and they really had no use for the Socialists, and so a lot of them were predominantly liberal, and I think the old saying in the North is that if you're a good Catholic, you go to church on Sundays, and then you shop at the Hudson Bay store, and you go to a Catholic church on Sundays. So that's
interesting.
There were two went together, sort of.
Yeah. How did your people become politically active? If when you think about your community.
Well,
was there
a lot of people used to come into our communities. There was, a lot of people. We have to talk about old Vital Morin, for example. Yes. He was a Second World War veteran. There was Leo Belanger. He was active in the sense that he would never, sit back and accept the way the powers that be were treating our people. For example, he was a Second World War veteran, and so he had this fighting spirit with him all the time. And he wouldn't accept an RCMP person or Hudson Bay person coming to tell him what to do. And he would fight back. And so in that sense, you saw that people were actually were being cornered. They were being pushed into trying to be submissive, or trying to get them to be submissive.
Was a lot of that over hunting rights?
Yeah, a lot of it was, that's right. It was hunting and fishing. And
you wanted to go and shoot a moose, you'd go shoot a moose.
Hunting and fishing, and just...
So that was going on?
Just trying to live the traditional way of life, and there was people there trying to control how you do that, and people were fighting back, and they were saying, no, you can't, that we want to do it our own way. And then, of course, we had people like Jim Brady, who used to come to the community once in a while. And then we had another gentleman that nobody ever talks about, and that's old Joe Martin McCollum was his name. He died years ago. But he used to go around talk about rights, rights issues. And then, of course, we were, the North was, really, really...
Ross Cummings, too.
Yeah, and old Ross Cummings, that's right, yeah. Those folks. And then there was old Chafee Morin from Turner Lake. And his wife, Chafee Morin and his wife. His wife never said too much, the old lady. But she always, when we had a meeting, when we had gatherings, she used to go and make bannock and used to make soup, duck soup or moose soup or something. And you see, she contributed to that sort of thing, in her own way. There was a lot of ladies that did that very quietly on the side.
Were there any women that were actually politically active in terms of speaking up with the men in the community that you can remember from back then?
Yes, there was Rose Schneider and those folks. And
later on, they became really
later on,
spokespeople for us.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But they were always in the background doing what they could?
No, they weren't.
No, they weren't.
Most of them were leaders of the locals.
They were
more
leaders,
women presidents we did men.
That's right.
Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
So what year are we talking about here?
You're talking again you're talking up into the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, late
Okay.
60s.
But I think when you go back and talk about, again, the North, we always heard stories about the northern people not going hungry because they could fish and hunt and trap. And we were in a position where we were more closely watched by the police because we again, were not allowed to do any of those things. And I think that's, later on, that played a big part of my fight for Métis rights because they already at that time, we considered them as having a certain right to hunt and gather because when they started giving welfare out in the 50s, they gave more to the people in the South than they did to the North. And the reason they gave more money to people in the South than the North is that the northern people could live off the land. So that became a factor in my constitutional position to say that they already recognize these people the right to hunt and gather.
Yes, absolutely. That's an interesting point. Exactly.
Exactly.
When you think about political events during your, I'm trying to figure out, like what shaped your political perspective when you were young. I mean, Jim, you pointed out that, you didn't know your identity, they defined you as Scottish, and so that was an aspect that, sort of spurred you on. Is there anything else, any other political event or anything, any leader that you knew in your community that's, inspired you, and were there any issues that you wanted to pursue other than, what you mentioned already?
Well, I think the first thing for me was the fact that when I started to wake up, I was born in 1933, and the war began in 1939. People started to gather to join the forces. And I found that up to then, there was so much poverty and racism amongst our people, and we didn't have a voice. We couldn't live in town in Punnachai, and we couldn't live just on the outskirts of the community. We could live by the nuisance ground, and nobody recognized us. But as soon as the war broke out, that changed everything. I have pictures, and I think you have in your archives too, pictures of maybe 30, 40 people that were outside of Punnachai at the time they were recruiting, and people volunteered, and that was Indians and Metis, and half-breeds in those days, of course, and they joined at that time to go fight voluntarily overseas. And I remember the troop trains passing through Punnachai because that's the main line between Vancouver and Montreal, CNR. And the troop trains would always stop and pick up soldiers and let them off, and we were quite involved in that. And that was the beginning for us to see our people go to war, and finally some money coming in to feed our families. And people went to war not because they were brave, but many of them because they were hungry, and they had nothing else to do, and they wanted to fight. They said, look, we'll go and help. But they were afraid to help. And that was my first taste of what you could call a reason to start thinking some pride in ourselves, because I could see that happening, and I watched these people move away. And I think the big thing that happened that really made the change in my life is when these people came back. The same people that got on the trains, the ones that came back alive, were a different kind of people. They were more vocal. I remember the beer parlor was no more than 200 yards from the station at Punnachai. The soldiers got off the train there that I knew came from Lestock, came from different places. They had bars across their chests. They had sergeants, corporals. They were well dressed, they were neat, and they were very vocal, and the first thing they wanted to do was go and have a drink in the bar, and the first thing that happened was the door was barred to them. And I thought to myself, how could these people go and fight for so long and come back and be denied the right to have a drink? And that started the whole movement. There was riots in Regina, of course, again, because the Indians and Metis were unhappy with things that was going on. And as a result of that, I think the feeling of the real movement started to begin to that. Because my argument is, I used to be fairly militant when I was young. I didn't know why. I got kicked out of school many times for not saluting the flag or not participating in a morning prayer. But I felt that, again, you know, this kind of racism, if my people can go and bleed for somebody else overseas, why can't they come home and bleed for us at home if we have to? You know, fight our own struggles.
So you saw the racism of the system against
Nothing
people.
changed. Nothing really changed.
Was there, when you think back in your younger days, did either of you ever have sort of a role model politician you said, now there's a person I'd like to emulate because you know, that person stands up for what I believe in? Is there anybody that ever inspired you, you know, back that you can think of? What was it? Who was around you?
In my days, it was Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. You know, let's face it, that's the way it was. We used to cheer for the white people, killing all the Indians in every goddamn movie we watched, and that was understandable because, again, of our teachings in the school. We were told that Louis Riel was a traitor. We were told that the Indians stood in the way of the railroad and had to be hauled off the way of the tracks, and they had to be punished, and they had to be jailed, and for good reason, because Canada had to be built. We were told the RCMP was out there to protect the Indians from the bootleggers, but they were out there to help the settlers take our land. You know, the missionaries, the old Red Power movement in the days when I was there, our slogan was, when the white man, the missionaries came over, they had the Bible, we had the land, and now we got the Bible, they got the land, you know, so that was a slogan that was amongst us. And then how do we gain back these, how do we shed all these things that were pushed upon us? So, you know, we actually learned by facing all these situations, and it was all based, like you say, on institutional racism. They were all there in the institution. So our heroes were really local people, again, who I realize now what they went through. You know, it took me all this time because anyone who was a leader in those days was put down by government and put down by RCMP and put down by everybody as really nothing but a sort of a person who was just trying to raise hell, you know, and not trying to, troublemakers, like, you know. Yeah. So they were treated that way, and you know, today the people that I thought the most, that I have the most feelings for is people like Geronimo, who stood up to the United States Army, Sitting Bull, who again eventually was shot by his own people, and Geronimo was taken in by his own people and given up, you know, and I feel that way myself at times, because when it came down to the nuts and bolts of things, always somebody had to be sacrificed for the next move. And people like Howard Adams, even though Howard and I had our problems, Howard was actually the guy who set the stage for the movement in terms of the way he'd done things and the things that he'd done through understanding the black movement, the movement amongst ourselves, and to be able to, with a PhD, when he spoke, people listened. Those days when we spoke, nobody listened. Nobody listened until we started to haul out 2,000 people at a time. Then people started to listen. So that's what it took from us. It took numbers, and that's why I said in those days we were far better organized, and our leadership came from right within rather than looking outside.
Jimmy, do you have the same sort of impressions?
Yeah, yes, absolutely, because when I was talking a little earlier about waking up people, you know, we had people, you know, that came in there, like Howard Adams. I remember coming in there with Jim, and you know, that's when Jim first started getting involved in at the provincial level. And one of the first things we had to do, of course, was get the North and the South together, you know, somehow, because we had a northern a northern Métis organization, and we had a southern group as well. And so there was always that, and it was purposely left like that because governments wanted that division. You know, they didn't want us to get together. And then that's when Jim, you know, came up north in 1969, I think it was, 68 or 69.
68.
And came to organize a meeting in Isle La Crosse. I was able to help. We didn't have any money, so we set up a little dance and, you know, those kind of things. And just to help these guys a little bit with their jazz and stuff like that. He came in with Howard Adams and talked about rights, talked about those kind of issues, and you know, talked about, you know, the right to be able to control our own institutions, like our school, our education, and stuff like that. And then we got people thinking, you know, why have we not got any of our kids graduating from our school? You know, they all quit at grade 9, grade 10, maybe at the very most, the outside, and you know, we determined that, well, because it's controlled and it's purposely done that way. So what do we do to change it? And you know, that's where Howard and you know, and Jim and these guys, you know, said, well, we have to get rid of the school board. We have to bring in our own, elect our own people from our own community who are thinking, you know, the same way. And then we need to develop some kind of a curriculum that's going to, you know, that's going to showcase our side of things, you know, and so to speak. And so we said, yeah, okay, you know, that may be the way to do it. But the awakening, you know, happened. It started to happen at that point in time, and then of course there was, you know, the destruction of the economy in the north, you know, where people were forced to live in communities. They're no longer nomadic to go out and
this was with the CCF and centralizing everybody in the communities.
That's right. Yeah, telling everybody to stay in one spot, and you know, the families couldn't move with you know, with the mother and the father on the trap line anymore. You know, so they had to stay. So how are they going to live? Well, you put them on welfare. So you know, that was the thing, and that's another form of control. You know,
massive family breakdown.
You remember how they got us into that, Jimmy? They said you people need running water, need power.
That's exactly.
In order to have running water and power, you got to centralize your community. So people are living no more than from here to Jimmy together in huge areas. And before they lived out, and families that lived together. And
all over the place,
all over the place. And when they done that, then the social problems started. You know, the alcohol and that. Because otherwise people were independent in those days, but yet they worked as a community. Everybody fed each other, looked after each other. And you could go to any place in those days and go to the log homes and always have a meal. People were warm. Furs were all over the place. People were healthy and happy. But later on, it turned into a nightmare for us under the condition of trying to help us. But all they wanted to do was put us into central spots so they could control the land around us. We were all oppressed. We were all oppressed people. We were all, you know, treated with racism and in many ways hatred, you know. And I think the northern people, when we sat down with them, found out that the church controlled their lives, and you know, and controlled their lives. And so many of our elders, even at that time, were tied to the church so close that even the younger people said something, they would be chastised by the older people. And so people like Durocher and Jonas Favel and some of these more militant people that grew out of the movement had to get out and fight with their own community, to change the views of the community. And that took a lot of work, and that because to fight the church in those days was a very, very difficult thing. And it was used against them because people like myself and others, and Durocher could speak much better than maybe the priests could in a meeting. Because I remember now in Laliberte, they called a meeting. 500 people showed up to actually try to kick us out of the community, including the church, the priests, the church, the police, and the Hudson Bay at that time. And the problem is, when I got up to speak, it was tough enough for me to speak to the Denny, who again were a little at odds with the Cree, to speak to the Denny in the north, and then to have the priest get up there and speak in Denny himself to convince these people to not to have anything to do with me. And yet we had some militants and radicals amongst us who were able to out-organize and actually use those kind of meetings to their advantage, to our advantage. Remember, Ted Bowerman tried the same thing with 400 or 500 people in Buffalo Narrows to get rid of us once and for all. And it more or less entrenched us into believing much more in our rights and our goals, because all we talked about is a right to self-determination, the right to land, all these rights we talked about. And that came up again as the result of the old Trudeau coming into power in '68, and Trudeau saying, look, you people, I'm going to make sure things change. And that really helped us. And I think, again, the North and the South were, the Southern people were really subject to so much racism that there was a bit of envy for the North, because the right to hunt, we felt their right to hunt and trap and fish anyway, even though it was restricted to some degree. But we couldn't move and do anything. We had to hide when we killed ducks. We had to be very careful if you shot a deer, and people would come and check our pots for cooking wild game.
Yeah.
And even on the Road Allowance, we used to dig scenic route and and stuff like that, and try to make a living. And people would be after us from all over for trespassing and stuff like that. So we had a really, really tough time. And I think again, when you talk about instigating these, what made us move is in 1945 there was a movement to move our people up north out of the Road Allowance, again to help us, but really to clear the land of our people, try to shift us where no one was. And they had the old Green Lake Project, of which they shipped our people in trains, and not in trains, in boxcars, in 1947, I think in 46 and 47. They moved all their little belongings into the boxcars. And I remember that as a boy, and one of the things that really bothered me, and it still bothers me today, our people lived in tar paper shacks, and just very little shelter. And as these people left their community with all their stuff piled on their wagons and chairs and little bits they had, the houses were purposely set on fire as they were leaving, as if to say to them, these people don't ever come back here again. And that was done at Crescent Lake, that was done in Lestock, and it was done in other communities. And as I met with other half-breeds a few years later, they had the same experiences. So again, it was, and people speak about the Holocaust for the Jews. Well, it was much the same for us in terms of trying to drive us from one place to another. And it was difficult for us, and it wasn't very long till most of those people just made their way back to Regina. And then we set up a tent city. Then we start moving into the nuisance grounds around Regina, where all the half-breeds lived. And then we had tent cities, and then people would come in there with their cars and trucks at night and run over people's tents and, drive people out.
These were people from the city of Regina?
They were right from the city, and they'd done that to the half-breeds, and even the Indians started to move into the city at that time after the war, and and really, I guess, that again started us to really hate the system and start to realize that we had to do something. So it helped us move into another level, and it caused a kind, I hate to use the word hatred, but that's exactly what it caused amongst our people, the way we were being treated. And again, how do we fight that? How do we fight that? And I think, like Jim says, one of the biggest things that ever helped us is getting together with the North. That kind of changed the whole political spectrum in Saskatchewan. And the good thing for us in those days is because the demonstrations were going on in the United States with the blacks, the Panthers, and who we met with a number of times, and actually, predicted what would happen to us in here, when we met the
surveillance, Jim did.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, for years. When the Black Panthers, especially when the time...
Yeah, we met with Hampton that time. What is his first name? Hampton was the leader of the Black Panthers, came to Regina with his 7 guys. They said they were going to get killed very shortly, 2 weeks or 3 weeks like that. They all got shot in Chicago.
You mentioned an interesting point that I just want to pick up on. You said that when they moved the people out of places like Bell Jenny and Willow Bunch and Crescent Lake and all of these communities, Lestock and so on, that they moved us there out north because they wanted the land. Was it the farmers lobbying to get that land, or was it?
I don't think it was the farmers so much. I think it was just the embarrassment to the government of Saskatchewan at that time, and of course their philosophy of hoping to find us a better life, which never really was the issue. It was to get rid of us and put us in the north, whether we survived or not, they didn't care.
They were trying to hide us.
Just hide us wherever they could and hide their shame for the way they're treating the half-breeds. And to keep our rights sort of under the rug, and to hope that we would never organize. And I think the worse they treated us, the more we became aware of what was happening, and the more we became aware of what had to be done to move ourselves into a position to be part of Canada, you know, not to be outside of Canada. And when the Constitution, the 1970 or 71 Victoria Conference got me thinking, and it got me thinking because they were talking about bringing the Constitution home, and it got me thinking because of the fact, as I said, when I went to get a job, we were not recognized as people. We were not even recognized. And we felt, and every time I asked for some changes in terms of legislation, they would say, we can't because you people don't exist really, you know. And in reality, you don't exist, although they had a half-breed act for us. I think you recall your historians tell you they had a half-breed act. But as far as they were concerned, we didn't really exist, and we had to assimilate. And that was a dirty word for us, again, assimilation, once we found out what it meant, Durocher?
That's right, yeah, it took us a little while.
So we then started to realize again what a job we had ahead of us. And that's when the days of people like Howard Adams came involved, and then he could explain these things and explain these big words and tell us in a sense what they were doing, even though we knew what they were doing. And Malcolm X was one of my big heroes when I was young. And I was looking more at his ideas of, you know, especially his speeches, the ballot of the bullet, things like that.
So we had sort of a double whammy on that issue that Jim is talking about, because we had to understand, you know, these things with the proper words and what they meant and how they fit in, you know, and what these guys were trying to do. But then we had a double whammy, because then first we had to understand ourselves, and then to be able to take this and bring it to the community level, at the grassroots level, and explain it so that people can understand. And you know, that took a lot of time, and that took a lot of effort, and you know, but I think you know, I think it happened.
Was people like you mentioned Howard Adams? Was Brady and Norris involved in any of that to any extent?
That was prior, but they were always talked about because they were just the people we actually took over from. Because, like I said, the North was separate from the South. And, you know, when I got up north, there was people like Vittel Morin, of course, and the young people like Durocher and Jim Fable and Jonas Fable, who were starting to take over.
Pierre Carrier from Cumberland House, yeah.
But, you know, and there's Bishop Rod, you know, to this day I respect Rod for what he done, and if it wasn't for Rod, we would never be here where we are. You know, he contributed, even though him and I had continuous arguments about what direction. But when you talk about community people who I really had a lot of respect for, there should be statues to them up north. There's people like Robbie Fontaine.
That's right.
Who stood up to the church, stood up to the RCMP, and stood up to the Hudson Bay. And I remember the priest calling him a crazy old man in the meeting.
Yeah.
You know, in an actual meeting, calling him that. And that man I had so much respect for. And really worked hard to help our people. Really worked hard. So it took a lot.
And Traveler, you know,
Traveler, guys who were, you know, guys who were drunks, who were considered as drunks in the community, became some of our best leaders. You know, people like Clarence Trutchy. Clarence, I have so much respect for Clarence Trutchy, what he done in his day. It'll take decades of somebody else to accomplish what he done in a few short years in Saskatoon before his death. You know, guys that could, and we're real half-breeds. We could sit down and tell stories about police and drunks and this and that, you know, because we all had our boozing problem. Like I've been sober for 44 years now, prior to 1960, but I knew what it was like to be an alcoholic, and you know, and I think government loved us that way, you know, because we always give welfare workers a job. We always made sure of their jobs, and we always made sure when we were drinking. If I went for a welfare check when I was drinking, got it, sobered up, couldn't get it. So they tried to drive you back to booze. So, we went through all this whole stuff, and like Jimmy says, the northern leadership, and I think, we got to go far beyond Isle of Cross as well. We go to places like Cumberland House, because we organized throughout the north, even to little places like Campsall, Portage, outside of Uranium City. We had strong leadership and people who could
James
speak up.
Auger and those guys, yeah.
What is that lady's name that lived in there?
Mary Jane Cazion?
No, that was this lady was Germaine Powder, wasn't it?
Germaine Powder, yeah.
From places like
Those are the ladies that I'm talking about that used to make fish, and they used to make dried fish and dried meat, and whenever we had a demonstration, they'd come and feed us. They'd come and feed us.
How did you get around in terms of funding for all of this back then? Because I'm sure that that you didn't have much money that was.
Okay, when we first started, when Jim and these guys first come up north, they hired me. There was not a whole bunch of money there. There was actually nothing for the first 3 or 4 months or something, I guess. And we used to go to bum rides. So we always, the strangest thing, but we got away with it for a little while anyway. You'd get a ride, the social worker would want to go fly someplace, like to Pine House from Isle Across. So you ask him, hey, give me a ride, there's just one of you, then a big airplane. So yeah, okay, we'd go there. And then we'd get to the goddamn place there, and then I'd organize a meeting very quickly and go after the social worker for being so goddamn cheap with the people there, right? And trying to get them to, hey, give these people their right, they have a right to social assistance, so there's no jobs, and finally it dawned on them, they're not going to give me no more rights. But by that time, Sinclair had gotten some kind of a challenge from Thatcher. Remember, Thatcher said, "Hey, I bet you couldn't organize 1,000 people in a meeting or something, and if you do, I'll give you $10,000." He said, or something like that.
That's what
Ross Thatcher said that.
Yes, Ross Thatcher said that, and by about within 2 weeks, we organized a meeting. I think it was in Prince Albert here.
Yeah, we got the meetings going.
Yeah, in Prince Albert, and we had about 1,500 people at that meeting, and they were ready to go, and we had a couple of cabinet ministers in there, and Thatcher said, we had a meeting with Jim, I guess, shortly after that, and gave us that money. And then we used that money, of course. What we used that $10,000 for was to organize a meeting in Ottawa.
Yeah.
Because we knew that's where,
For the powers.
Yeah,
Well,
powers.
I think Trudeau was a great help to us. Trudeau became a personal friend of mine after we started to meet, and I think Trudeau was the one who was talking about his just society and participatory democracy. That's the two things we started to get money on. And Ross Thatcher hated us to the point where he told Trudeau not to give us money, and Trudeau was both liberals. And Trudeau said, I don't give a shit what Ross Thatcher says, we're giving you money. And they gave us money. And then we organized, because Trudeau thought we were some of the best organizers around. And it was sort of fulfilling his dream of getting these social...
Well, he liked the grassroots work that was
moving,
happening.
Communities on the move. And so we were well liked at that time by him, and he helped us out. And I remember, like Jimmy says, I always stayed in Sally Ann's places when I was organizing, and go to Prince Albert, even in those 10-bed units, and I had to sleep there for 25 cents a night. And even when I got a plane ticket to Ottawa, we had to take what they call the red eyes. I'd have to stay in Winnipeg for maybe 6 hours, and I'd have to go and sleep in the Sally Ann's there, and I'd have my ticket, make sure I hung on to my ticket to catch the bus back to the airport. And people would be laughing at me because they'd say, here's a guy that's going to Ottawa on an airplane, and he's sleeping in the Sally Ann's. And the same thing in Ottawa. We had to sleep on the street sometime, until we got Trudeau starting to listen to us. And those days it was, you either met with the Indian Affairs Minister or the Health and Welfare Minister who was delivering social programs. It was Trudeau who got us to meet people from the other government departments, some of the high ministers, like the Quebec ministers. What did they call there's the big fellow there, they called them what the heck did they call those people from Quebec? They had a name for them. Very powerful leaders from Quebec. We met with those ministers. Jean Marchand was one of them. We then got, Len Marchand just got into Parliament, but he was we were at a conflict with Len in those days. He became a strong ally because we felt he was in the system. We didn't realize he was trying to change the system too from inside. So we became people who would went to Ottawa with our grievances, and we took trainloads of people to Ottawa to meet the CMHC for housing. We filled out a brown paper one time on our housing needs in Saskatchewan with a little $5,000 grant.
Yeah.
And instead of putting it in a real nice report, we wrote it on brown paper. And in fact, I still got some copies of that. Dumont should have copies of that too.
Yeah, I think Dumont's got it.
And it showed that we were living in a space that was less than a jail cell, each one of our people. And that's when we signed, later on, we signed for 50,000 units across
With
Canada.
Ron Basford.
Ron Basford.
Yeah.
So we were able to move things along. We went there to meet with the Minister of Manpower that time, and remember, our guys, of course, you know, were still drinking in those days, and that's the guys could really organize the demonstrations. Had a meeting with the minister, went in there, and Nappy and I were sober, of course, and we went into the meeting, and pretty soon 2 more guys come in, another 3 more guys come in, and the more they came in, the rougher they looked. And finally the minister got, Bud Cullen was his name.
Bud Cullen.
Said, look, if this is what's going to happen, I'm getting out and walking out of here. And I said, you walk out of this room. I said, I'm going to sit here and wait until you come back. I said, you're not man enough to face us and deal with us. And he came back and he sat down with us. And that's the time things started to move again, because we got the rinks going in Isle Across, the old folks home in Buffalo, and there was the rink in Cumberland House, and a bunch of our offices were built that time because...
You got funding for that?
We got funding for that. We were told by the province, if we get the money from Ottawa for the labor, they'd provide the materials. So we played one against the other. We went to Ottawa saying we got the materials, and now we need the money, and then we went to the province and said we got the money, we need the materials. So finally we got, and people were so anxious to work and do something. We took old tires out in Isle Across and started burning them around the perimeter to start digging the foundation.
For the rink.
And the province was so embarrassed. Pretty soon, a few days after that, the lumber started rolling. See, the differences we had, like Howard and I got along. I still had a lot of respect for Howard up until his death, even though he wrote some bad things about me in his books. But, you know, I never, ever took the respect I had away from him for what he did in terms of putting us on the right track for the whole movement. But Howard, in his own way, was a fairly wealthy man. You know, because and one of the things I believed in, I said, why should we work for any less than we would if we were working in another job? You know, our people deserve a fair wage for a fair job. So when we got money to pay the board of directors and our workers, we paid them, tried to pay them going wages, because pay them less, they were stealing them away from us.
We consider them, you know, in the same category as MLAs or MPs. That's what they do. That's what they're supposed to do.
So we did. We paid them, and that's we felt. See, Howard felt we were more in a revolution, and than we were a movement, and that's where we differed a bit, because a revolution's when you really go to war with the guns and that. We used militant acts, and we had militant ideas and very radical ideas, but I always felt that we didn't need to die for it in that sense. You know, we'd use this to move our way into gaining our rights and gaining our rightful place in Canada, rather than to fight another war. We felt the Metis already fought a war in which we actually didn't lose that war in a sense. We still had the spirit there, and you know, and it all became.
All you had to do was wake up the spirit.
Wake up the spirit, because there was a philosophical argument there again about we had, you know, which really got a lot of dialogue going, whether we should go to Ottawa and ask for a pardon for Riel. You know, and there was always this pardon for Riel, and I was against it. I was against it. I said, why do I want a pardon for somebody who didn't do wrong? We should be asking for a pardon from Canada should be asking us for a pardon for what they've done to us, when we had legal representation in Ottawa, and they took it away from us, and they took away our rights. You know, it wasn't a rebellion, it was a war, it was a resistance.
It was a resistance.
So we pegged it that way, and I think in the end we got more out of that than we would have if we had admitted it was a traitor, or it was a more rebellion, you know, because I never ever believed it was rebellion. I knew it was a resistance. We were fighting for rights of our people, and we had that right for that struggle, and the struggle was squashed, but it just remained dormant. It was always there, and the feelings were always there. And I was surprised when I started to travel around to communities and met with people like Jimmy and others, and Medrick and McDougall, that flame was always there. And they were saying, how can we get back? How are we ever going to get back? And when we started these demonstrations and occupations, and we could occupy, I remember one time when we needed to, we occupied Prince Albert, the DNS in the north, and La Ronge, Regina, Saskatoon, even Buffalo Narrows and Yorkton, all in the same day. Now, how many people could do that, could put together an organization to do that? You'd think it would take days and days and weeks. We could organize it in 2 days. Just a few phone calls, and people were there. And people took their grub, and like you say, people fed each other as much as we could and looked after each other.
That's amazing.
The whole community would come in and help.
You had to have dedicated people that really,
dedicated
fought
people
for what they believed in.
I never forgot that. I've never seen anyone do that in my life. I don't think it'll ever happen again. So it wasn't a one-person leadership. It was the masses that did that.
And there was that thread all the way back to 1869, in fact, 1885, and then, laid dormant there, but that spark was there once you
Needed spark.
When you think back on the political process in the community when they started the movement, was there one party in the communities that they said, well, we don't want to go with the Liberals, we'll side now with the end?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the CCF, or was there or did you sort of play one party against the other because you mentioned that, or was there actually one party that everybody said, well, this is the party we should actually support, as opposed to the Liberals, say? Because I think that, the church was with the Liberals.
Much on that. We never really... I always argued that the parties were the ones that put us in the position we were. Nobody ever went to bat for us. We had to go to bat for ourselves, and that's why we run independent candidates, and we almost won. Yeah. We almost won with independent candidates, and
we put them all in the same mold. I mean, they were all just as guilty. I mean, whether
just as oppressive.
That's right, just as oppressive. It doesn't matter what political label you put on them there. Whether left wing or right wing, they were all
hated us.
Was it, you probably got together, it sounds like, with Métis organizations from the other provinces and so on. Was there was everybody on the same wavelength when you talked about it between the prairie provinces, or was there a lot of difference there?
We didn't realize it until much like going to the north. When we first started out, it was like, when I lived in Punachai and Lestock, it was like our own community that faced all these problems and nobody else, because we were told by government everybody else is happy, because we had no communications. But when we went to Fort Capel, we found out things were the same. We went here and there, things come to Prince Albert, things were the same. We started getting communications from the north, they were the same. And once we got together and we said, hey, we're all in the same boat. We got the same issue, we got the same agenda. Let's work on it, even though each community might have an added agenda on maybe fishing and trapping, another one maybe on more economic. That's how we started to organize. And then once we got our own act together, then we had Alberta, which was already fairly established because of the Métis colonies, the Métis Betterment Act in Alberta, and Stan Daniels at that time was the leader. And Stan was a charismatic leader, whether you like it or not. Stan was a good leader in his own way. And they came to Regina and we exchanged meetings, and we said, hey, let's spread this across Canada, see what happens. And then we started to deal with it, and pretty soon we had a national organization. It was a very powerful organization.
Spence in Manitoba?
Spence in Manitoba. We had people in BC who organized. Oh man, we had some good people. We had some excellent people who were always with the rights, always with the rights. I always felt that programs belonged with institutions, and we wanted as much as possible to stay out of the programs and keep a political organization. Because if they were to cut us off as a political organization, our institutions would stay alive. If you connected everything together, then they could cut off everything at once. So that's why I said when we lost our money for almost a year, we never took over one job from any one of our institutions, Dumont, our sports, our housing. We stayed on the outside, and we had to go hungry sometimes, even though I had a family of 7 children, because we didn't have a paycheck, and we wouldn't take anything away from anyone. And the government realized how dedicated we were at that time.
They were just
baiting us
to take over these jobs. They were waiting in the wings for us to do that.
And we never.
And we didn't.
That is tough when you think back on it, being a politician and you don't get the benefits that a politician from the provincial or federal government would get.
Even today, you look at Jim, for example. I'll use Jim for an example. He's been 25, 26 years in, in politics, close to 30 probably.
40.
40, and he doesn't have any pension, nothing to fall
Yes,
back on.
exactly.
I spent 28
What
years
is it now? If you're in
Nothing.
office for 2 terms or something, you get a pension for
Oh,
life
yeah.
after that?
Oh, yeah.
If you're federal or provincial, I think it is, or something like that. And that's not that didn't
right.
never has happened
And this
as
is
a
by
leader.
choice,
That's
we
the saddest
did
part, I
that.
think, of
That's-
our
that's
people today is
unfortunate.
that we talk so much about our elders, yet we forgot about them, in the sense that they're not recognized the way they should be. You're one of the first peoples to ever do this with us, in the sense of try to get some sense of history. We've heard so much of Dumont and so much of Real, and nothing in between. And the great leaders that came between those eras,
The forgotten doers.
forgotten guys like like Joe Amiot, who had such a
yeah.
struggle
The women,
to hold a job, and to try to speak for us at the same time, and we looked down at Joe because he said, "This guy's got nothing." And it's the same way they looked at me. You got nothing. When I first went up north, they said, "How in the hell can you help us when you got a hitchhike up here?" And that was the truth.
It's true.
How can you help us? You can't even help yourself. And I said, but together we can help ourselves. Together if we do this.
Again, you raised some interesting points that I'd like to clarify. When I think about the early movement during this 20,000 people at Batoche in 1971, your ideas about starting your own Métis Parliament and so on. I mean, you're talking about a lot of what you're saying here is we're self-governing.
Yeah,
And
we're
was
self-governing
land
already.
claims or anything about scrip
Yes.
ever
Oh,
talked
no,
about during that
absolutely.
We
period?
talked about land.
Yes.
Yeah?
We talked about
Yes.
land. Land was
Well, what were the issues
Land-
around that, if you
Well,
recall?
I think basically we always knew that, we always looked at ourselves as a nation of people, and when you're talking nationhood, what is one of the first ingredients of a nationhood? Well, you got to control, you have to have land. That was
Land
the
is
most important. That is paramount. Land, and then you have to control your own institutions. You have the right to control your own institutions. Citizenship, yeah. And then you have economic development. You need to feed that. You need to be able to, to raise the finances to run those institutions. And then we knew that we needed to do that at a community level, and then we needed to. That's what people were telling us to do. That's the direction that we wanted to go, because it has to. If you're talking nationhood, you have to have land, and then you've got to be able to control all of that yourself. I mean, your people need to control that. You can't have non-Aboriginal people come in there and run it the way they have been. You have to move away from that.
Was an argument articulated by Métis people on what basis they should have that right to land? Back then?
just as an inherent right. We always believed in our inherent right. We always believed that we had the same rights as the Indians. And we wanted to make sure we exercised that right. And so we always had that sort of, I think there was a growing form of nationalism amongst us, and that's what really pulled us together. And when you stopped, and Jimmy's right, when we started to look at ourselves as a nation,
Nationhood, yeah.
rather than just a people, we felt that the first thing a nation has to have is its land, and then its citizenship, and its control of its institutions. And I always looked at coming into confederation. I hate, some people may laugh at me when I use that word, because we were outside of confederation. And we wanted to come into confederation during these constitutional meetings. And we wanted to come into there with our rights, our full
our plans
guaranteed
and
rights, and come into confederation under our conditions with Canada and negotiate with Canada our conditions. And that's exactly what we done. We wanted to make sure that we were there. We wanted to make sure we were recognized, because we wanted to become part of Canada, not to be outside of Canada. And we wanted to have those conditions. And I think that we were on the right track, and we never strayed from that in any of our meetings. We always held firm. So I think that, again, if you go back and you take a look at us, that our development over the first years was based on our history. My history being a half-breed, which I'm really proud of today, to be that half-breed, rather than just people call me half-breed. I love it, because I always say to anybody else who calls me anything else, I'll say, if I'm an Indian now, I have to legally, not legally, illegally. If I stuck to our treaties, would be okay. But I go back and I have to ask permission from a white man to go and hunt on his land, or else I'll be charged. Half-breeds won their right to hunt and fish and gather now. So I said, if I'm a half-breed, I can go any place. I can go on the reserve and go and hunt. I can go into any community and go and hunt because I have that right, because that's constitutionally right. So I have more rights than others to hunt and gather. And I think that if we take some of those ideas that we have and develop them now, we're going to have not only our place in Canada, but we'll have place in Canada under conditions, and to be a partner. I want to be a partner in Canada. I never wanted to. That was the difference between some of us and some of the leaderships. More militant guys just talk about you know, a revolution of which we take over the country. I said, no, we just want a kind of a quiet revolution where we take over control of our destiny.
Have our own place.
Through the constitutional and institutions that we can develop.
So
those
people that were really radical that said that we want to, you know, was there any talk about using violence during that period?
There was violence. There was violence. There was violence. There was killings went on. Durocher lost his brother due to that. Cross.
Right.
So there was violence, and of course there was struggles. But we always had the kind of leadership in Saskatchewan where we were considered nationally by all the organizations in Canada, including the federal government, who said that whenever they heard we were coming to town, every department got together in Ottawa wondering, what are these guys after? So, you know, I hear stories today about how feared they were of us when we went to Ottawa, because we meant business, and we had support at home.
Yeah, we always had made sure we had support at home.
You don't get that today.
Maybe you can talk a bit more about your involvement in the political institutions that led up to, you know, the whole constitutional changes and so on. Maybe a bit about the background and the political movement in AMSUS and so on, and talk a bit about AMSUS, maybe about what was that political alliance about, and what were the issues and that kind of thing, and was it a strong alliance? Given the fact that you had, you know, non-status and Metis involved in that political organization, what were the dynamics like in that whole thing?
Well, for the AMSUS organization, I think the history of it speaks for itself. You know, the fact is that we were saying 20,000 people to Batoche, demonstrations you could call within a day. You know, that was the result. I think again though that we understood in Saskatchewan that we could not do it alone. We had to branch out. And I think, you know, as we looked at our activities in Saskatchewan, we had people like Durocher. I think Durocher was, as far as I know, the best at it that I've ever known in terms of going into community and could organize, could speak the language well, get along with everybody, even if it was a Dene community, could, you know, knew everybody. So we, in a sense, had that sense of organizing. And if it wasn't for Durocher, I would never be the leader of the Metis for 20 years, because he was able to move people and never looked at saying, I want to get rid of Sinclair and I want to be the leader. You know, it was sort of a team we had, and that's what kept us in power. But then again, we also had our opposition, and even our opposition that was against us still had the same ideas. And that was a good thing about us, because we could turn around and say to anyone, we want to do this, and they'd agree with us. It was the method of how we got there that people agreed or disagreed. And that's where we had our ideas and our sometimes our problems. We had academics in our organization, and as we started to grow, people became lawyers, and people became teachers, and people
social workers.
Social workers. So we developed people, and some of those people would move away from us and take part in sort of being government people rather than with us. And I don't blame them, because the government offered the money and the jobs, and they had to move, and they had to then dispense with government legislation and that. So it made some of us get along, some ill feelings. But we always had a group of us who were very strong in terms of the rights issue, and never ever put it in the back burner. Never put it in the back burner. And I think that's where we had the respect of the communities that we worked with. because I don't care what people said, even in the back of their minds, no matter what they said, they always knew that oppression was there and that they were oppressed and their parents were oppressed and the people before them were oppressed. And how do you get out of that oppression? How do you take your place? You know, so there was that kind of a movement. And I think again, you know, that in those days, Durocher, and Durocher will tell you again that, you know, it was that dialogue amongst our communities that kept us together. You know, really kept us together and really kept this movement going. And in the South, you had people like Nappy LaFontaine, who was sort of the conscience of our organization. You know, community, people, people, people. He would meet with ministers with 30 people, never go there by himself. And his reason were always, I want people to be involved, I want people to know. Ministers get mad and say, how can we deal with 30 people? Well, if you can't deal with 30 people, you're not going to deal with anybody. You know? So that was his executive. And his commitment, again, was so strong that you know, there was no doubt about what he meant and what he wanted to do.
Yeah, and in the North we had people like Pierre Carrier and Nap Johnson. And you know, those Vital Morin and you know, Louis Morin and old Robbie Fontaine from
Old
Roche.
Robbie was
What year are you talking about here exactly?
We're talking the 70s.
70s.
In the 60s, when you think about, you know, I'm sure you read Dobbin's book, 1 1/2 Men and so on, and when you look at what...
Never read Dobbin's book.
No, you never did?
I knew Murray was never really a supporter
Yeah, he used
of
to
mine.
work for us. Yeah.
He never was a supporter of mine. And, and people who weren't supporters of mine, I didn't, you know, I didn't really, you know, I used to talk to, like, to, you know, to be nice, but I always felt his feelings was more on a basis of kind of a revolutionary bit, or kind of maybe he was struck too much to socialism, in a sense that he looked maybe at that would solve our problems. I never looked at the problems right or left or center. I always looked at the problem, looked at the best solution. And if it's conservative government could help us find NDP, no matter, you know, I never was born, and I wasn't educated enough to know philosophy really well. So that was a good part of me. I think a lack of education helped me very much, because I was educated by experiences, by meeting with ministers, by meeting with people, and that's the way my education was community driven. So that's where I really got the benefit from. And like I said, the northwest side, we always keep talking about the northwest side. That was where the heart of the movement was, in northern Saskatchewan. And then the east side sort of got on track, and then we had some very, very strong and good, powerful leaders from the east side. What was his name that got killed in the plane crash?
Lionel Deschambault.
Lionel Deschambault. One of those people were there to really.
Lawrence Yu.
Lawrence Yu was a
good
powerful supporter of us.
And his wife. His wife was a real good organizer as well, you know, at the community level.
We had a gathering of 500 people in Prince Albert just before the constitutional talks, and they came together to decide what was happening at what would happen at the Constitution, also to whether to accept Defying's offer or not. And I wanted to support it because I felt it was a beginning, and of course the tone at that time, there was some people who said absolutely no side deals, either all of us gets it at once or none of us. And that took the wheels off, because I thought there was never a chance of all of us getting everything at once. Everything had to be done in little bits as you organize, and maybe one huge parcel in the north or two huge parcels in the north, and smaller ones throughout the province. I said my feeling was always, I have no problem if there's a large settlement in northern Saskatchewan, I will still have a homeland. You know, even though it's like the Jews. I said, they got a homeland in Israel, they live in New York, they live all over the world.
The majority of them live, you know, they live in New York, Chicago, Detroit, you know.
And people used to try to compare us to the Mexicans in the United States about the struggles they had. I said, don't talk to them about their struggles. They got a homeland. They can go back.
They got a home.
We have no place to go but to fight our struggle here. We're unique in that sense. And we had more in line with people like the Palestinians, who the delegations of Palestinians used to always support us. You know, so we had some ties to some radical groups, and some of those people wanted to get into violent acts. But again, I was not into the violence in terms of our people. You know, were having enough suffering without getting into things that they didn't have to be, even though they could happen sporadically because of the way we met and because of the problems we had with the government, where some people did get hurt and some people did get killed. But at the same time, I felt that I had a responsibility to save lives, and rather than to give lives. And I felt that we should use what we have, political savvy we have, to be able to negotiate and bargain, and to say what we had to say at the table, not to turn around and say it at home and not say it to the table. And that was a very difficult time with some of our people in those days, and I can't blame them. They used to go to meetings with the Premier, and they made sure they had shirts and ties and suits. And I got criticized for a meeting with the Premiers in blue jeans, and I was the first guy to meet Prime Ministers and everyone with blue jeans. I didn't care. And people said, well, you shouldn't be doing that. That's not nice. Even radio talk shows used to talk about it, because at a time we were very, always in the news. Everything we did was on the news. So we had to deal with that, and I thought that kind of an image was more of an image that I could carry on with the general population of our people. We were that kind of a people, a blue jeans kind of people. So it identified with the people, and in those days you had to be very careful how you identified, because you did have this growing radical movement, and you had this other movement, which again were part of the people who were educated, fairly educated, and good education, some of them, who said, look, we can work with the system. We can work within the system. I said, no, we can't work with that system. I said, it's not working for us. We got to get ours and then fight our way into Canada's confederation on our terms. Get in there and have our rights protected, much like the Indians.
You raise another interesting point when you talk about identity. When you talk about Métis people and non-status, and they're in AMSUS and so on, was that an issue that was debated hotly? I mean, about who a Métis person was, and who should get membership and so on. Was
that continues to this day?
Yeah, it's always been an issue. But was it a hotly debated one during this period? Was there?
1987, it really came out.
Yeah.
See, the separation of the Métis in 1987 and the Métis Society and us, I was in a real predicament, because I'd led the Métis for 20 years. I'd fought for them in the Constitution. I'd spoke up all I could for them, and then it came to the point where I said what I did at the constitutional conferences, and they came back, and there was a large meeting of even my strongest supporters in the Métis movement said to me, look, it's your time sink, you got to go. And I said, okay, we'll go, but let's not use the courts, because I said, we have been an organization and a people where we've stayed away and don't trust the courts for anything with us. We wanted to stay away from police and the courts. So I said, let's sit down and let's work out a agreement where we separate in terms of and conditions of you go with all the institutions and everything that belongs to Métis. We'll just go aside, but recognize our organization for the people who still don't have their status and who are Indians. And because we have a place in the Constitution too as well. I don't believe in such a thing as non-status. You're either Indian, Métis, or Inuit. And so we wanted to struggle on that basis, and somebody said, no, we can't wait, we're going to go to court. So they went to court, and it made it look bad, because it made it look like I was trying to keep these people together, even though a lot of people wanted to stay together. Said, look, it's too soon to separate. We've still got a lot of work here yet. And of course, but people were still after the money, which we were finished. We were not, AMSUS wasn't going to get any more money, because what I'd said to the premiers in Saskatchewan. And so when it come time to look at the money, I said, look, I'm not going to take 1 cent from the Métis, nothing. It's theirs. We built that up. It's theirs. They've had nothing for all this time. It would be ludicrous for me to fight for their money. So if we're going to get money, we'll get it on the basis of being from somebody else. Our government should look after our needs in terms of address our needs. And that was one of the disappointments I had, because I felt we could separate without having to use the courts, because I never was a court person. I spent, of the 20 years I was leader with the Métis, I spent 17 of those years in the courts, because of the fact that you were elected by the people. You were subject to government regulations. So you had to walk a fine line, you know, because we were also the first peoples in Canada, I think, to actually have a democratic one-person, one-vote organization.
First ones, yeah.
First ones.
We introduced that, yeah.
When you think about people like Harry Daniels and Clem Chartier, certainly were involved at that time, and they must have played a part in you know, in all that debate.
Clem at that time was more of an academic. He done a lot of the research and stuff for us, and he done a lot of the papers for us to use at constitutional meetings. Kept that part of it alive and had his following too, and it was a fairly militant following. He had people who would criticize us very much if we made the wrong move. One of the very strongest people and afraid for people like me to sell out, you know, which I don't blame at the time. And I think that was voiced.
Voice, absolutely.
Sinclair's going to sell out on us sooner or later. And I had to be careful about that. And I remember having people behind me every time I'd go to a meeting, don't you dare sell out. And I said, never was my intention to sell out.
What did they mean by sell out exactly?
Well, sell out was to give in the government to accept something that was unacceptable. In fact, the unacceptable at that time was to walk out of the Constitution without getting land, the right to land, or the right to self-determination. That was kind of the sell out.
Not pushing the rights issues, you know.
And I think we can talk about that later on, but the Harry was a very strong supporter of the Métis and the Constitution, although Harry, I don't know why, and I can't understand to this day, never became a Métis leader. You know, should have been. I don't know why he was never accepted as a Métis leader, and he was always with the Native Council of Canada. Eastern-based organization, and had good support from the East, and was always, with the group that was, in a sense, fighting with us, you know, fighting with us in terms of our...
That is interesting. I never thought of it that way, but, you know, Harry's what is he, just outside of Regina, you know, born and raised there, and yeah, it's a good point. Why didn't he become a leader of one of the Métis organizations?
He ran a couple of times. But
yeah, he certainly did.
Yeah,
yes.
he ran. He was vice president of Alberta, I think, one time.
Yeah, vice president.
With Stan.
Well, he would have became president that time, but what happened is he had a campaign going against Stan Daniels, and Stan Daniels was an old, smart, not stupid. Stan Daniels had a lot of money in those days, and during Harry's campaign, he sent him to Europe to be ambassador for the Métis to Europe. And
Harry was in Europe. Harry came back 30 days after. He says, "What happened?"
But you know, in defense of Harry, he was always a strong supporter of Métis rights. He had a showmanship way of doing things, but he did his share in terms of Canada's recognition of the Métis.
Oh yes.
And I think when we look at history, if you look at it from that point, he was certainly a Métis activist in terms of Métis rights. But if you look at it, you know, differently, the organization he belonged to and the position they took was against us. And it was hard for Harry to come out in support of us without being in, you know, getting into trouble with those people that he'd led for a time and then was out and then back in. So it became something that we really had had some problems with, but at the same time, the Métis movement was strong enough that I think people all recognized that it wasn't going to die. Wasn't going to die, never. And I think, you know, when we get into talking about the Constitution, how that happened.
Sorry?
After dinner.
Just before we get into that discussion, I just wanted to go back to the creation of Gabriel Dumont Institute. What was the background of that movement? Were you involved in that firsthand? You must have been in some way.
Oh, yeah.
We were.
What was the whole objective there, and why was it? Maybe you could talk a bit about that. You did mention it a little bit earlier.
Well, I
what
think
was your roles in that?
You know, we always felt we didn't like. We did have at Batoche one year what we called a burning of Canada's history books. I don't know if you heard about it.
Never heard about that.
That was made big news. We took all the history books we could find, went to Batoche, and we
Is
had
that right?
a big bonfire of the history books.
Wiener roast?
Yeah, we burned them all, and we said, you know, and Howard Adams was there, and we gave speeches and said, you know, this history Gone, untrue, and we've had a
is that right?
real demonstration of it. And when we did that, we said, well, we have to get our own history in perspective, and we have to educate our people. And how can we educate our people where we are in control of the education system?
Well, we had to be in control of the education
We had to be in
system.
control of
We
the
had
system.
to be.
At the same time, there was the big argument of mathematics is mathematics. You got to teach it, and you got to teach it right. So we got to, if we're going to eventually have teachers and an institute, we still got to learn to live in the everyday world. So we don't want second-class education, but we want to include in our education our history and our rights and a different perspective of Canada and a different perspective.
The history according to us.
History according to us. And that's the whole movement, is kind of the Gabriel Dumont Institute, and is driven a lot again by Nappy-LaFontaine. Nappy-LaFontaine had a little center in Capel, Fort Capel, they called the Capiche Center, where they had little classes in that. And he became the strongest person for the Dumont Institute. Durocher and myself were involved in the Dumont Institution.
We were the first board members, but that's all we were. We didn't play too much of a big role
board sort of thing, and we pushed Dumont, and we fought with governments, and the government finally relinquished and did enter into the agreement for the Dumont Institute. And then we got a board elected, and that board ran that institute by elections. And of course, we gave it direction, but it didn't have to take all the direction we have, and we had our problems hiring certain people. We wanted to hire old people, and we did. We had Dr. What was the doctor's name we had there that, you know, I'm getting bad for names, but
me too.
We even had Keith Goulet take over our institute at one point in time. And we had some high-profile people. Even though if we didn't agree with their politics, we thought we better hire them because they are educated and they know the system quite well. They know to do it, and we want the top-grade education. So our struggle was to get that going, and what bothers me over the last few years, and I'm glad you guys are doing this because Jimmy and I were talking about it. I hear a lot of people getting up and actually saying in the news media and in the documentaries that they were people who started, I don't want to mention any names, I didn't give names, but saying we're the guys who done Dumont, you know.
Yeah.
And Dumont was done 20 years before these guys, we ever seen these guys.
I think you were probably just born, eh?
So I think we need to put things in perspective and give credit where the credit is due. And again, if you go back, the communities are it was this Dumont was community driven.
Yeah.
So you can't give any one person the whole credit. It was community driven.
By the people.
Yes, it was by the people.
Don Nielsen was one of the big
Because we had little classes in our community before Dumont.
Yeah.
and, you know.
This is a question that is probably a silly question, but I still want to ask it. Why Gabriel Dumont? And I know that he was our leader in this, you know, in 1885, our military leader and so on. But was there any debate about that at all?
Yes, there was. Yes, there was. We had lunch that day. Remember in Regina? I remember that time. And Nappy-LaFontaine was the guy that again. He was the guy who said, "Well, what are we going to call it?" You know, we didn't know what we were getting as usual. We didn't know what we were getting into. You know, I had no idea that you know that it would one day become, you know, what it is
Look at it
today.
now.
Yeah,
Amazing.
But at that time we said, what are we going to call it? And Nappy said, well, we'll just call it Gabriel Dumont Institute. He said, just out of this clear blue, just like that. You know.
That's a good question too. I think you raised, because I think really in my days there was more of a tie to Dumont than anybody. I think,
Yeah.
Even though Riel was a kind of he was more or less a higher figure sort of thing. We could identify with Dumont. We couldn't identify with Riel. You know. There's a funny reason about that. I don't know why that was amongst us. It was quite common in those days.
Well, I'm sure that you never had the vision of what Gabriel Dumont Institute would become. And when you look at it today, I mean, you must think, you must sit back now and say, wow, you know, like, boy, think what we started back then and look what happened now. I mean, you never envisioned that at all, I'm sure.
No, absolutely not.
The thing that I might be a little bit sorry about today, I was watching the opening of the Indian University. I was thinking we could be at that stage now if we had maybe kept our elected boards and kept our vision. I think it can still grow. I think that it can still be, it can still happen, because I think we still need to educate our people. And we still need that sense of history you talk about. And to do the things you're doing today should have been done a number of years ago. But I think when you go back, again, and the breakup of the AMSUS organization, I was disappointed when it first broke up, because I remember the Métis leader saying to us, Durocher, they didn't want to even ever mention AMSUS again in any of their history or any of their future, because AMSUS to them was something that should be forgot about in the past. And I didn't like that, because again, it was kind of an insult to all those people who were dedicated to this movement. And the best part of it is those people who were dedicated to this movement were the Métis themselves that were in AMSUS. Those were the organizers of the demonstrations. And I think there's been a change over the last few years. I notice it now. They recognized myself in Edmonton a few weeks ago with a plaque and the Métis Nation Order of the Métis Nation, which I thought was a great tribute to me. And other communities have recognized me for my work, and you know, that's a change that's going back again to remembering the leaders. And I told them in Edmonton, I said, I don't know of anyone in this movement in the history of Canada that was well organized as better than the old AMSUS people in the days of AMSUS. And there never was, and there never will be ever again, I don't think, in my lifetime. But I think again that that, you know, if you go back, the half-breeds have to take the credit for that, all that. It's all done by the half-breeds, and there's now, you say, the Métis. You know, those were, you know, and there was a lot of, there was never an argument really much, and some guys would argue about the fact that, oh, you're non-status or this and that, but it never really was a factor.
Yeah.
Never was I wouldn't be the leader if it was a real factor. You know, I would never have won those elections I did over the years to win 20 years in a row.
It's kind of interesting when you look back and you think that, you know, when you created Gabriel Dumont Institute, you kind of sowed the seeds for the future in terms of talking to people like you and setting the historical record straight. Because now they're coming back and we're, you know, Gabriel Dumont Institute is talking to people like you. And that's great in my view, because like I said, there's that gap in the literature, and it's people like you that, you know, like when you say nobody wanted to talk about AMSUS, you know, forget about it, that's not correct. We need to record that history and make sure that it's there for future generations to take a look back on. And, you know, like people like you that talk about that part of history is so important, because you were the people that lived it. And, you know, that carries a lot of weight. And, you know, because things get distorted, and we want to make sure that, you know, future generations have this to look back onto and, you know, see what things were like from the people that lived there.
That's right.
Do you see a different type of leadership now in comparison to those people that you know, when you look back on all of those grassroots people and the way everybody pulled together, and you take a look at the leadership now, what are the sort of changes, differences you see in the leadership, or are there any?
Well, I don't see a whole lot of community involvement. I don't see a whole lot of you know, people that, you know, dealing with those issues at the grassroots level. They spend an awful lot of time on programs, you know, being concerned about programs, or trying to get, you know, program money for this, or program money for that, which is all right. I got no problems with that, but they forget, you know, a lot of the leaders today, they forget the community. They forget the grassroots, you know, what people are concerned about in the grassroots, you know, at the grassroots level. You know, they forget the bread and butter issues, you know, or what I call the bannock and lard issues. And, you know, those are the issues for housing, for example. They don't deal with a whole lot of stuff about those kind of things, you know, and which we consider rights issues. You know, they spend too much time, far too much time, in trying to run, trying to administer programs. You know,
Same problems the FSIN.
Same problems the FSIN. Yeah, you know, and they need to refocus their attention at the community level. I mean, you know, otherwise we're going to lose, you know, whatever political momentum we had, you know, going for us, you know, in terms of the politics of the thing, because the Constitution is not. Sure, we're not talking about the Constitution now. It's not, probably won't be opened up for another round.
They don't need to.
Yeah, they don't need to do those kind of things, you know, because it's there already, and you know, everything that was fought for by people like Jim Sinclair is there now already. You know, and all we need to do is do something about it. Let's move on it. You know.
Do you think that the funding, when you look back on it, played a huge role in that in terms of not being accountable to the communities? Because now you're accountable to politicians in regards to where you're spending this money and so on. Has that been something that's really taken?
No. I think that time we were still responsible to government, more so than you are now. but we walked a fine line. See, what we did in the old days, and this is where you really don't see in the days, and I work with a lot of treaty Indians. The treaty Indian gets their honorarium, goes to a meeting, and they go home after the meeting. We would hold a meeting and do our duty. If it was a meeting about education or a meeting about social something, we'd do our meeting, but we would stay after the meeting. And we would hold another big session about our political awareness and about what we're going to do.
We'd tie it in.
We'd tie it in.
Or
we educated,
piggyback on it.
Piggyback on it.
Yeah.
So we never wasted a buck on that. We never wasted $1 on that. And
Today you'd have 2 separate meetings.
That's right. If
we'd do our job and do our meeting with the answer to the government for our money.
If we
and
had a
then
meeting, if we had a meeting
another
about education, for example, we'd get some money from Department of Education to do that meeting. Okay, so we'd have it, and we'd make sure that it's
Report's done.
But then right after that meeting, then we'd say, hey, let's have a political meeting. Let's talk about politics here.
And we'd go at that for hours.
You kill 2
however
birds
long
with
it
1
took.
stone.
So we were able
And
to
people
do that.
knew that.
And you'd invite a lot of people from the community. Now you sort of, how is it done? I mean,
I don't really know. But
is it done more with the executive and people in positions of the affiliates as opposed to, I'm not sure myself.
Well, we were all community meetings in those days, weren't we? Oh, everything was community.
Everything was community meetings.
Yeah, and there was
And that way you were more
you didn't have that big, I'm an executive, attitude like Jim was the president, but he was still just a half-breed, Jim, get in here, we need you, we come and, let's talk, let's have a meeting. But now, well, they try to make a big deal out of it, like the president is coming and such, and then they, and that kind of turns people off, at the community level. People don't buy that, they don't, you got to be one of them. I mean, it's,